Hello, my project is called Collective Quarantine Holiday. It is a facility for both viral and social pandemic in the form of a holiday camp that references the quarantine procedure from the quarantine facilities. The quarantine camp is designed for around 5,000 people that, along with the current trends in Hong Kong, provide forms of leisure from isolated to collective, depending on the stage of quarantining. When people stay in one area for 14 days and become dependent on leisure with certain level of collectiveness, they can enter to the next space with larger collective leisure. The fluid landscape of leisure is integrated with an ultra-utilitarian, self-tied rigid living unit system. The journey forms a linkage between the outside and the city, which illustrate the relationship between the rigid living units above and fluid leisure landscape underneath. The change of scale from individual to collective of living units and leisure during the journey follow the direction from outside towards the city. The whole project started with an observation before, as it raised my attention on the relationship between the balance of discipline and leisure. Before COVID quarantine, democracy is described as a virus in Hong Kong. Chinese diplomat and Weibo say Hong Kong protesters are virus. While all of the pro-democracy protests and organization is being cancelled with virus control as cover, it made me realize that political demonstration in the virus requires same kind of measured space. At the same time, in other part of Hong Kong, leisure started to grow everywhere, inside to outside, individual to collective. I then started the research by looking into the first time where pandemic created a new form of life for citizens in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong Plague period illustrates the history of how governing power changed citizens' form of living. During the plague, foreigners and Chinese lived in different areas. The government started to create sharp segregation and recreate new forms of living in the city when the plague hit Hong Kong. They set up quarantine camps across the city, regulate living conditions towards foreigner standard, and rebuild the whole area with the British standard. They execute these orders by introducing and misusing parks and leisure space to create a counterbalance for citizens and distract them from sharp segregation and breakdown of the original life form. This strategy of governing successfully changed citizens' forms of living to Western standards afterward. And to the current COVID protest period, it visualized a similar situation. With the quarantine situation, the government want to propose segregation as a new form of living by these new quarantine camps and hospital experiment. This is a newly constructed hospital using the quick deploy system that took 4 months. This is a 4,000 people quarantine camp built by the government with the same MIC method that only took 5 months. This one is the modification of an exhibition space. Segregating units are deployed to facilitate basic needs for the people being quarantined. The tendency of these quarantine camps is that controlled straight segregation, which will be the new form of life, are being experimented with these fast deployed structure under the name of quarantine. On the other hand, leisure become more important as the counterbalance for the authoritarian to impose new order. Besides those citizens who are in the experiments mentioned before, other citizens are being exposed more under different leisure than before. For example, party room, a new type of business that became very popular during the COVID period. It is a place full of leisure activities under one roof where people can book and privatize the area. In smaller scale, leisure is growing inside everyone's daily space. People intervene their own daily space with leisure. They also start to alter their own living room. Leisure in these cases is being misused as a distraction on contentions. As time spent on leisure will push to a new high, and people's emotion and concentration on protests and political demands become lower. This is also actually nothing new in Hong Kong and in British culture, where leisure, like a holiday camp, is used as a common tool to engage citizens fully away from other things. What I conclude from the research is that virus as an opportunity. Virus measures are being misused by the authoritarian to experiment with segregating citizens in different scale, as to recreate a new form of living following their order. While leisure is being misused as a counterbalance to depoliticize citizens and distracting them from the contentions. But what if we refuse to follow the new order, refuse to be depoliticized, and refuse to enjoy ourselves within the leisure. With protesters in Hong Kong showing that protest itself is no longer working, rather than actively resisting this unstoppable tendency, might the architecture of quarantine and leisure be reorganized in a different way, can counter the idea of leisure as depoliticizing too. The collective quarantine holiday aimed to form a counter-experiment of a purification journey that extrapolate the founding of the research. The project fills citizens' life with leisure in an increasing scale of living from living individually to city-scale living. As to redefine leisure, not only as a tool to fully depoliticize citizens in a strictly governed city, but also as refusal to work. The site of the project is located on the island as the only vehicle connection between Hong Kong City and the airport. The island, like the rest of Hong Kong, is mostly mountain terrain. Here's a section showing the relationship between the outside, the site, and the city. The project aimed to form a purification journey as a linkage between the outside and the city. The linkage illustrates the relationship between the strict segregation system, which is the rigid living units above, and the fluid leisure landscape underneath. The change of scale from individual to collective, of living units and leisure during the journey follow the direction from outside towards the inside. This change of living scales of camps in Hong Kong illustrates the sequence of living pattern for the project, which from 1 people unit to 2 to 8 and to a large open area with many 1 people units. By referencing these precedents, I create a series of living units from 1 people to 2 to 5 to 9 and to many people. The capacity of the living units gradually transit from 1 people, which is top left of the screen, to many people, which is towards the city. Here shows the general setting of different scales, unit location, in relationship with the leisure landscape below. The front part of the rigid living area is constructed with the MIC construction method used in those precedent, and the later part is constructed as an open floor with many 1-person containing units. And then for the leisure elements, I looked at existing forms of leisure in the city, from individual to collective, from private library to stadium, race course, and Disneyland. A catalogue of these examples is then formed. Leisure elements are layered on the topography following the flow and journey from individual to collective. Leisure are placed on an outer landscape or freely on slope, depending on the function and requirement of space. Here's a section showing the relationship between the rigid living area above and the fluid leisure landscape underneath. Here's illustrate the journey from inside of the living units to individual leisure area to collective leisure area. The grid, which is the location of the surface core and the living units, is placed on the topography to form an interaction with the leisure. Individual leisure area are separated from collective leisure as the rigid living units touch the ground and form an isolated area from the collective leisures. Leisure area become more collective and open towards the city. The end of the collective quarantine holiday, which is the city, become the largest and most collective leisure area. On the other hand, undefined areas between leisure facilities are being opened up for the residents to immerse their life in a bottom-up way. As the segregation unit is small, tight, leisure and living activity will spill out to the ambiguous area between the leisure elements. This ambiguous area strips become a big living room without walls. Design for architectural elements in these strips aim to open up a kind of space where residents might appropriate and experiment living at different scales with each other. Rather than determining the scale and making enclosure, the strip create pockets area with landscape elements and structures that provide opportunity for residents to engage with. Elements like the little shelter, step sloped, array of light pole provide vertical structure for residents to experiment their own form of living. Pedestrian fences and little duns differentiate and slightly separate in space without making enclosure, provide landscape for them to appropriate. Sheltered wall stripped and little stages provide a larger non-enclosed platform for them to engage and occupy. This area provides different sizes of pockets for citizens to gather, to eat, and perhaps meet new friends under the shade. segregation, as it becomes the only living room for 5,000 people to share with, and the residence blocks above become the shelter and perimeter. Sheltered wall might become a temporary party room, or maybe a concert hall for performance. Little Duns might become an outdoor cinema, tent area, and sunbathing place. Pedestrian fences might become a place for hanging clothes and playing mahjong. The extremity of the project might lead to some unexpected and experimental social life to happen in these ambiguous areas, as they provide opportunity for a new life of residents to emerge, develop, and occupy. This experiment of a purification journey that fills citizens' life with leisure in an increasing scale of living until reach the city scale aim to cleanse and purify citizens with leisure. The combination of densely packed leisure landscape, self-tied living units, and ambiguous occupiable strips create a new form of leisure for residents to purely engage with, without any means of working in productivity. Fully engage with leisure redefine leisure from a depoliticizing to a refusal to work and to authoritarian. Such new relationship between the leisure, quarantine, and living might give some space for different forms of life to start emerging in this, without them being overtly politically active against the power. For example, full engagement population on leisure might create potential disruption to the colonial power. That's all for my presentation. Thank you.